My name is Brooke Heaton. I work at 411. We are a full kind of shop, communication shop with offices in Washington, D.C., Seattle, and in Germany. We do a lot of Drupal and WordPress work. We also do a lot of analytics and communications, kind of branding and print. And I've been with 411 for a bit over a year. And I'm going to talk today kind of at a high level about a project that we are still working on that we kicked off in 2016, and we launched some of the first sites last fall. And this is for the Fairfax County Public School District. So I'll talk a little bit at a high level about the project and its goals, but I'll also get really into the weeds as well. How many of you are actually developers or back-end developers? Is anyone here not a developer? Okay.
I'm fine.
Okay. I won't do too much fun. I'll talk a little bit about Twig. So I'll talk about the client and their challenges, what our goal was, our technical approach to the project, some of the lessons learned, and then if you have questions, I'll answer those as well. Some of the key modules that we've used here, we initially used config importer. It's actually not a module, but rather an installation profile. Default content, I'll talk a little bit about that. The migrate module for Drupal 8, feeds, web form, and Twig tweak. So a little bit about the client. So Fairfax County Public Schools is a really massive public school district. They're the 10th largest school system in the nation, largest in the Baltimore, Washington area. 180,000 students and 100 more schools and institutions. They actually have more buses than the Greyhound fleet. So they're a very, very large system. And they had a number of challenges. They actually had numerous websites, none of which really had a unified content management system. They were using Dreamweaver and other ways to kind of hand write all the code. And then they had different platforms. They had some Cold Fusion and some .NET. This is probably very familiar to you if you've actually migrated a legacy website. But for a school district with as many websites as they had, it was a huge challenge. This is an example of one of the schools that we did upgrade to Drupal 8. This is a legacy site. Obviously, it looks a bit dated, so that's a bit of a problem. And then what we wanted to create was obviously a modern content management framework so that each of the schools could have their own CMS. They wanted to standardize the look and feel. Obviously, when you have 100 and some sites that look different, like for a lot of the parents in the community, it doesn't provide any branding. It doesn't unify the actual school system with any identity. They also wanted to be able to customize individual school sites, right? So you've got your own school colors, you've got your own school mascot. You want to, have your own authors for your school. So we needed to be able to have a unified framework with over 100, and I think it's going to be 195 schools, but also have a unified structure, unified code base. They also wanted to syndicate content, meaning they had news, blogs, and other things that they wanted to basically project from a central website and have all the other sites import. And then they wanted to translate the content into Vietnamese, Mandarin, and a number of other languages. So it was a pretty ambitious goal. They had no way to actually manage users, right? So in the past, you would basically have an author who would maybe log in, edit files in Dreamweaver, FTP them over to a server. This would provide them with the ability to have actually authenticated users and track them, and also disable or block them, which is really important. Then they wanted to migrate legacy content. They had a lot of news items they wanted to be able to bring in from their old site. And then also importantly, if there was an emergency at a school, or maybe if there was a snow day, they wanted to be able to project out alerts to all of the schools. Oops, sorry. Right here, this is an example of the original central site's homepage. So if you were working for the central administration, for all of the policy or the central news, this was their website. Obviously, it looks a bit dated. And this is the new site. This is the new central website. So it looks, obviously, it's very image heavy, has a lot of iconography. We completely revamped the menu system, and it's highly responsive. And just to give you a taste of kind of one of the school sites, we'll see if I can pop over to an example. Actually, this is one. This is actually a live version of one of the school sites. So you have the ability to show news on the homepage, and it just looks a lot more modern. You have a calendar, much more vivid imagery, and it's highly responsive as well. So that's basically what a school would have got upgraded to through our Drupal 8 migration. So that's pretty nice. So this is the concept of content syndication. So essentially you have the central website, and if you had news or blogs or staff profiles that you wanted to have imported into each school site. Each school site receives either a migration import of content from the central site or feeds. We also use feeds to do this, or we also, actually I think those are the two methods we use. We use migrate and feeds to basically take content from the central site and import it into each of the school sites, and I'll show that in a moment. In terms of the code, we're using Pantheon's Upstream. So this is essentially one main repository, and each of the schools have their own repository that basically merges those upstream updates into its own repository. And this is all managed by Pantheon. They have some things going on behind the scenes. But conceptually, this allows us to have one common code base, so we don't have to worry about 195 bugs on 195 repositories. We can fix them in the upstream repository and bring them down. If we have new functionality that we export to configuration in Drupal 8, we can bring that configuration down. We can run update hooks using the upstream repository as the basis for it. So far, I believe we've launched over 20 of the school sites. So this is an example from the dashboard of Pantheon of all the different schools. And as you can see, each of them are customizing their sites. They do have the ability to configure their own site colors, but for the most part, a lot of the information architecture and the layout and the branding is very identical. But at the same time, we give them the liberty to change their site as they wish through content. So technically, the Pantheon Upstream, again, it's a Git managed upstream process. We are able to review updates in the dev environment for that upstream just before it goes live. So we do have a testing cycle where we can make updates, review it on dev and test before we actually push it to live. We're using Pantheon's command line interface called Terminus, which makes this a lot easier. You can actually do batch processes. So when we need to bring down upstream updates to all of the sites, we can run batch across all. Once there's 195, you can imagine how long that would take to just do updates. It would take a couple days probably. And then there's also Quicksilver is basically a cloud hook system that Pantheon allows you to run things like configuration imports once you've deployed code, and that's been very helpful to us as well. Just full disclosure, Form 1 uses all kinds of hosts, so we also use Acquia on our own. This is not a advertisement at all for Pantheon. It's just noting that we're using that. If you log into a dashboard in Pantheon, this is one of the school sites. If there is an update in the upstream, what happens through the UI is it will just tell you have updates available. You can merge the updates downstream. It'll run update.php if you want to. Just check that box. It can also auto-resolve any Git conflicts, hopefully. But we don't actually use this UI. We mainly go through in the command line. So in terms of the technical implementation of Drupal 8, the great thing is configuration is now in code. In the past, we used to use features. Now we can actually export configuration and have it committed. Twig theming is really helpful for us. We're able to do a lot of things like avoid panels and embed things like views and web forms and blocks right in the templates. We're using display modes, views, and migration. Those are all in core now. We're also using tweak. Sorry, that's actually tweak, not tweaks. Feeds. We're using a lot of paragraphs to embed content. Search API, Migrate Plus, and Config Installer, I'll talk about it. We initially used it, we no longer use it. We're also using Pattern Lab. For front-end developers, this is very important to have structured atomic design where you're creating smaller components, like you're able to theme fields or theme paragraphs, and you can eventually theme a view. A lot of reusable components that we're using with Pattern Lab, and as a developer, the ability to look at what the themer, what the designer has in mind and make your code match that through Pattern Lab. If you haven't used Pattern Lab or this kind of approach of I think it's called I don't know, sometimes they call this an online style guide or something like that. It's fantastic. Tweak. Has anyone here used Tweak? Tweak is basically allows you to do a lot of things in your templates with Twig. So, for example, on our sites, we're embedding views or embedding blocks or embedding web forms right in the template. In the past, you would have had to do this through maybe panels or using Page Manager. And I'll show you an example of that in a bit. We also, for the site colors, each of those site colors is a light color and a dark color. So if your colors are like purple, you would have a light purple and a dark purple. If it's like purple and orange, you'd have a light purple, light orange, and dark orange. We're basically just injecting variables into the templates to do that. So this is what allows each of the schools to have its own site colors. And the way we did that was there's a module called Color Field, and you can actually have a palette of colors to select, and each school can select their own colors from the palette. So there's a really nice UI for that. This is an example. If you look, it's not entirely clear, but in the node header, you'll see in brackets and twig dark color twice. That's an example of where we're injecting that variable right into the template, and so each of the school's dark colors would match whichever hex code actually equates to that color. And this is something we're doing with Twig. And the other thing is you'll see at the bottom there's a Drupal view where it says related blog posts. We're embedding a view right in the Twig template right there, so we don't actually have to go into Panelizer or something and embed a view. We can embed the view right in the template. You can even pass arguments to views if you needed to. So Twig has been very helpful with this project. I'll talk about Lingotech. Lingotech is a translation service that we initially used, and we unfortunately are no longer using it because we did have some problems with the integration in Drupal 8. We also initially used something called Configuration Installer. If you use install profiles or have used install profiles, anyone used install profiles in Drupal? Okay. Config installer is just a simple, quick, and dirty way to do this. You can basically put in your settings.php file, your configuration directory, tell it to install via configuration installer. It also provides a UI to do that. But we had some problems with this in terms of we didn't want all of our configuration imported at once, and we needed to split it, and we needed to filter out some configurations so that each school could have its own unique configuration that was specific to the school, but we would also have global configuration. So I'll talk about that now. This is an example of where you'd have config installer. This is just in your profiles directory, and we threw that out, unfortunately. And this was something that I implemented, and a colleague came along later and said, oh, we need to change this. So that was a lesson learned. So now we use an install profile. Sorry about the misspelling there, but we have a config directory that is set in settings.php. It imports the configuration on install. So we can just run drush si. We can basically pass in our installation profile. But then we have school-specific configuration that we have to filter out, so we're able to filter that out. And then we also have post-install hooks that allow for default content to be added. So each of those sites that we build, it comes with default content. It comes with a header. It comes with a homepage image. It comes with a number of pages already. And that's using another module that I'll talk about in a moment. But here's an example with settings.php where you're saying, this is my config directory for syncing. And then also, this is my install profile. So that when you install the site, it will use that directory for configuration to import it. And here's an example of where you would go to Pantheon. You can, via drush, say, OK, install my site using the FCPS school profile. It will install that. It will run post-install hooks. It will also import all the default content in one fell swoop. And then one other thing we're doing is we're using drush to set a lot of the site settings. So here, this is using drush to set the site name. So if you wanted to, basically that just sets the configuration in the database. And this is an example. This is just to clarify. So this is the installation profile where it says FCPS school profile. You'll see two directories. You'll see sync, which is global configuration that will be installed when you install the site. But then also there's additional configuration that's only installed when you initially install the site. It won't be imported later. So if you were to run drush CIM, the configuration and install would not come in if you've already installed the site. Does that make sense? So this allows us to set all of the settings for each of the 195 sites so they're identical, but it allows us to also set certain things aside and not have those update later. So this is an example of something that we found to be extremely crucial for us to do this, and it is basically using the config filter plugin, I think if that's correct. The config filter plugin allows you to say don't import specific configuration when you run the config import. So you can imagine if you had a config file that said the site name is FCPS school, but your school is actually maybe Woodward High, you never want to overwrite that. So this is a set of configuration that when we run drush CIM or import configuration, that configuration will never be overwritten. It allows the school to have its own configuration and not have it overwritten globally. So this is a really important thing with the installation profile as well as with config management in Drupal 8. I'm going to pause here and see if anyone has any questions because I know I'm going a little fast. You guys good? Okay. So another really important thing was we didn't want to just simply build a site and say, okay, log in and start building things. A lot of the users are not experts. Like these are people who are teachers, like a math teacher who's also on the side like a web developer or a web content manager. And we also wanted to demonstrate kind of best practices, right? So all of the sites come with default content. We have landing pages. We have a news page. We have images. We have blocks that we provide for them out of the box. And so this module is super awesome. I will say there is anyone from Media Current? Okay, you all have a new module that's YAML based. Yeah, so I'm really curious to check that out because this is JSON based and it's a little hard to read, and I'll show you that. YAML would be cool, and I don't know if it'll do everything we need it to do, but that's something we might explore. Default content is awesome. You build content on a site. There is no UI for this, but you use drush commands to export the content. And it exports it into a directory. I think it's called content. You can export blocks. Anything content in Drupal 8, for the most part, you can export. Feeds, actually. Individual feeds importers are content now. What? You have pages. You have blocks. Taxonomy terms. And all of the entity relationships between those can be imported. So you can have a page that's based on a view. It will import that. You could also have a page that's associated with a taxonomy term. It will import both the node and the term, and it will associate them together. So this is very helpful even if you're doing development and you hate using migrate because it spits out like a massive URL that's not useful for a front-end developer. This is very helpful if you wanted to simply export the content that you have and re-import it later too if you're doing development. I'm a super big fan of this concept, and I will check out the YAML one as well. In each of those content entities or content files are based on a UUID. This is an example of in our post-install hook. Once the site is installed, we're calling the Drupal service for module installer, and it's installing that default content module. And it's a one-use thing. We only need it once. It installs it. But this is not enabled on the sites. It only installs it on install, and then that module's never used again. The reason is we don't want to import default content twice. I don't actually think it would necessarily do that, but it's a precautionary step. So this is something that's part of our install profile to get the default content in there. And this is an example of where the default content module is and how it's structured. So you have the FCPS default content module, and then in that content subdirectory is important because that's where the module is going to look for the content. So you see blog content, you see feeds, you see files. It actually imports images. I'm not sure about the YAML one yet, but if it can do that, I'm a big fan. It'll import menu links. And if you were to go down the list, you'd see taxonomy terms. You'd see landing pages. All of that stuff gets imported on install. So each school site, if I'm a user of the site, all I have to do is go there, log in, and I've already got content. It's not specific to my site. It's generalized, but it's there. And this is an example of the format of the default content. So it'll provide a route to it. It'll provide the metadata for it. For instance, there are unique identifiers, so the node ID will be 12 when it comes in. So if you're interested in default content, I really suggest checking this one out. We used Migrate Plus. If you've used Migrate in Drupal 8, Migrate Plus basically just extends Migrate. But it allows you to do things like migrate content from a CSV or an XML file. So we actually initially performed some migration of the default of the legacy content via the Migrate module. But we're also using it because feeds in Drupal 8 is not entirely mature. Has anyone used feeds in Drupal 8? Okay. I'm not sure where it stands today in July 2017, but at the time we used it, we couldn't really do what we wanted to. So the Migrate module is perfectly suitable for doing what we do. We actually have a centralized file on the central website where we can import users using their user records. And anytime, say, a staff member were to leave and that user is removed from that list, they'll be blocked. So it's really helpful for some of our imports. We import a number of things via Migrate. This is just an example of a YAML file in Migrate. Migrate in Drupal 8's fantastic compared to Drupal 7. The YAML files are so much easier to use. So this is an example of where we're importing users from a CSV, and it will just set all of their data. Feeds we are using, as I mentioned. Feeds is not extremely mature in Drupal 8, but we are using an RSS feed. We actually found the RSS view to work fine for us. So we're able to have RSS feeds on the central site. They create news and blog and other announcement feeds, and those are actually imported on, I think every half hour they're imported by the school sites. So if the central if the central site or the central administration puts out a news or a blog post, it will automatically be imported by any of the 195 school sites. So this is kind of the networked concept where you're pushing content out from the central site and it's being imported by the school site. And I'll demo one of the school sites and show you an example of some of the content that comes in. We did have to work around some of the limitations of the feeds module. I'm sure they're patched by now, but it was a bit of a pain. For search, we're using Search API and Solr in some facets, so we do have the ability to search content on the sites. It's increasingly becoming more robust in terms of its search functionality. So here's an example of content on a site with search where we're using facets. In this case, it's actually on the central site, so they can search any of the schools. Each of the schools has a unique number or a unique identifier, and we use that for other purposes. For instance, we have the ability to import all of the school staff, and that's from a master list that the central site has, and they're filtered by a school ID, and when you set the school ID on the import of the school site, it's able to automatically import all staff members as well. So news, blogs, and we also have staff profiles. One interesting demand of the client was the ability to have alerts, right? So they wanted to have a feed of some kind of RESTful, JSON or XML feed that would push out an alert. So, if there were an emergency or if there were a snow day or if there were a holiday, every school would have a pop-up show up, and that could be broadcast from the central site. And we essentially just have a listener that is, looking for the central site. It's polling the central site on a regular basis and looking for either a global alert or it's looking for an alert that's specific to its school ID. So if there was a need to push out an alert to one school, you don't need to have that school log on and add anything. It will simply push out an alert, and that looks like this. Basically, an alert will pop up at the top of the school page saying, there's an alert, and you can close it. Okay, so a few lessons learned about this project. Using Pantheon's Upstream was a bit tricky and delicate. We actually had to have them revise the process. I think this was the first Drupal 8 Upstream they built. So make sure you're testing an Upstream before you implement it. It's tricky because we actually use Pantheon's Drupal 8 core repository. We bring that down to our repository. We do our own development build in one repository, and then Jenkins does a build to GitHub, which is then, I think, built to Pantheon's Upstream. I can't really map it out, but it's quite complicated. And we did run into problems where we had some merge conflicts, and we just basically it's like when your internet doesn't work and you have to unplug every component and then reset it all. That took about 3 days. So if you're working with an Upstream, whether it's Pantheon's or your own system, it does take a lot of testing to get it right. The other thing was we had problems with configuration. We weren't sure how we were going to manage it, and we were on a very tight timeline. So we essentially initially just imported the global configuration and didn't export specific configuration files, and we found that to be problematic later on. So now we're basically splitting configuration into 2 directories, which we find very helpful. And we're also filtering out specific configuration that we don't want to import. Obviously at some point I think we're going to have better automated testing for 195 websites. I don't think we have anything yet. This is very familiar, I'm sure. Config installer was very tricky. We ended up abandoning it. Sorry for the typo, but translation and reversioning did not work, so we abandoned Lingotech as a module. In terms of the client, they're extremely happy. I mean, a lot of these authors who were maybe teachers who had to moonlight as Dreamweaver developers are super thrilled about a CMS. There are a couple legacy platforms they wanted to try to integrate into Drupal, including their course catalog. Like, that wasn't something we really could do, but maybe in the next phase. I think it was also hard to kind of communicate Drupal 8 capabilities at the time. Last fall, there was a lot of, I think, premature modules that had to be patched or things that we weren't sure how we could work with them. We had issues with users and logins, of course, which is very typical, but because we're centralizing the user records, that was one of the problems. Also, there's a learning curve on using configuration and migration in Drupal 8, which was certainly a bit of a hard time. And then Search API, we also had some various problems with Search API. I believe the Search API module and Facets module, for a long time you had to have the right combination of versions for them to work. I'm not sure where that is now, but I think Pantheon ended up having to create something custom for us to get it to work. There's a few more links on here, but I will maybe just pop over to one of the sites just so you can take a look at some of the things we have. So this is an example. This section, FCPS News and Features, these are actually being imported from the central site onto this individual school site. So anytime you see like West Potomac High features, these are their own content. This is the school-specific content. Obviously, everything is like headlined West Potomac. We also have an event calendar. So the event calendar imports central events that are global to all schools, but also it allows the school to put their own events on there. And then these are just announcements. I believe the top ones are specific to the school, and I believe the lower ones are actually global. So again, you have global content mixed with school-specific content, and it's quite brilliant. I may be able to log in to my local and show you one thing really quick. Just want to show you how the site's colors are set, because it's kind of a fun widget that we came up with. So each school needed to have, its unique colors and their own unique mascot and all that. So basically, we took the under the theme settings for this theme, you have like a color palette. So I could really quickly go in here and say I want red and red, and save that. And ideally, if this works as it was designed, that passes an argument to the theme layer using a variable in Twig that sets the new school colors. This was actually helpful to kind of win them over, because they wanted to be able to figure out how to make different school sites. And that's an example of configuration that would not be exported. That would be specific to the school. So that's kind of a cool feature as well. But yeah, if y'all have questions, I'm happy to dig deeper into the technical stuff. Other than that, that's pretty much the concept. Y'all have any questions? Is anyone here working on a large-scale site where you have to kind of hammer out dozens or maybe 5 or 10 sites in one framework? Not yet?
Yeah, we have a similar thing like that. So the config filter in relation to the web form, is there details on that?
So I'm no longer the active developer here, and why did they do that? I don't know. I'd have to ask.
Okay, right.
My thinking is, and this may be wrong, but I'm assuming it might be possibly a web form that's not going to be used on all sites, possibly. But I don't know.
We run into the change on production, and then you do CIM, blows things away.
That's likely what happened. Whatever your experience was, we probably had the same thing, and I think we had problems getting from YAML form to web form as well. But yeah, you saw in that config filter that the web forms were excluded. Something happened there, and I'll ask about it. I am no longer actively working on this project, but it's being maintained by someone else. But yeah, web form has been quite useful. I use it on another site, and it's very handy. Just to kind of highlight, this type of structure, this type of process will be helpful for any .org, .edu, .gov. In the federal sphere, you have a lot of agencies trying to consolidate dozens of websites. The alternative to this would be something like a multi-site, or in Drupal 7, you would have used like a multi-site with site-specific modules or global modules. And this is an example where you have the same ability to do both of them, but rather than using one single code base, you're using an upstream Git repository to bring it downstream. And we found that it works really fantastic. There were some hiccups and some realizations along the way that we could have config file conflicts or UUID conflicts, and we had to work our way around them. But so far, it's working pretty well. Cool. Any other questions? Good. All right. Thanks for your time, guys. If anyone wants to ask me one-on-one questions, I'm happy to show you the code and what we've done. Thanks, guys.